Guys, gonna quickly run you through a build that I've been running, inspired by Samthedane, good friend of mine and a Cabal member of TOG. Basically, it's an AoE Psyker, but with the damage is just insane, and I wouldn't say it's a broken build as opposed to the beam, but it does absurd damage, so let's take a look at it. The build basically evolves around using diverse tactics, which basically hits bestow a 5% stacking resistance on the enemy for 5 seconds for the damage type of the attack. Against all other damage types, the same opponent suffers +1 stacking vulnerability. The reason you can use this on a Psyker without punishment is because you can cycle between damage types. So when you're buffing the damage for one type, you're nullifying the damage to the other type, and it's just a constant cycle, and the damage gain outweighs the damage loss basically just from the vulnerability stacking from all the other perks, which I'm going to get into. The next perk we're going to use is Force Weapon Mastery, which is each attack with Force Weapons bestows a 15% damage to further Force Weapon attacks for 5 seconds, maximum of 10 stacks. We're going to be using Warp Rods and using Warp Blast, Witchfire, and then spamming Hemorrhage. And then the last cooldown is basically, well, last perk, sorry, is basically Psychic Boon, and that's just the psychic powers last twice as long. It really just makes it a quality of life perk where you're not having to constantly keep buffing and moving and buffing. And with this, I feel that I can get from one Warzone room and then clear it out and then rebuff in the corridor and then like clear the next room. Buffs usually last around about 2 minutes. Precog does decrease duration every hit you take, but the base duration because of this lasts 2 minutes, so it does make it easier to play basically. Attributes, we've gone into Force because we're using warp damage and basically just the extra 1% damage. I'm not too fussed about suppression on hits, so I haven't gone the extra milestones in this. I mean, the milestones are pretty lackluster. Suppression on hit, movement speed, not really that bothered. The -% of warp heat would be nice. I could maybe min-max and get that, but I don't really struggle with warp heat at all because I'm able to spam Witchfire and Warp Blast, which kind of reduce the heat anyways, and yeah. My basic stats are dodge, not too fussed about dodge. Damage reduction is 36%. Physical and heat warp resist, they really don't help at all. It's damage reduction you want, and this is basically because it scales with the damage reduction for 5 seconds after each point of warp heat gained. And because we're gaining warp heat every time we get hit with precog, that this just constantly stacks, and this is a bit of a playstyle you've got to get used to. For example, it's worthwhile letting a normal mob fire at you while you're clearing trash because it will stack your damage reduction. So it's a bit it's a bit uncommon to be playing a kind of AoE DPS and having to take damage to gain damage reduction, but it's just how it works basically. The only alternative would be like a heal on demon kill, but that's really crap. Basically, we're going for the mandatory warp rods. This 10% damage for each debuff on the target on both rods is just, you can't compete with it right now. Really, it just should be 10%. It should only work off the first rod, or the whole damage debuff on target should be reduced. It's really strong. It's basically how this build's so fucking overpowered. I mean, I don't like using the word overpowered, but it's so strong that just the combination of all the skills, I'm going to get into it now. Basically, we're running the full debuff tree for Dirty Fighting, where you get a stack and 1% damage for each debilitating effect on the target. Vulnerabilities are counted as multiple effects. From what I gather, this skill is balked a bit. It's basically not 1% damage, it's something like 5 or 10% damage. I'm not sure on the correct number, but it's basically similar to Optimal Dispersion. It's doing too much damage to what it's meant to, but even without this, without Dirty Fighting, the build still does a lot of damage. Like, I believe Sam's build doesn't use dirty fighting, but I thought may as well use it. Why not? Then I've got 3% to all the armor piercing because I have armor piercing on my skills. I've got 3% crit chance for every debuff on the target. That basically eliminates me needing crit chance on my gear because the debuffs are just stacked and stacked from diversive tactics. So it's just, yeah. And then demoralized, targets suffer 3% extra damage penalty for every point of vulnerability. This stacks like max vulnerability, so it's like so much damage penalty for enemies. This isn't damage reduction on my character, it's damage reduction to what the enemies deal, so it stacks. It's pretty impressive. Movement, we've got the usual cooldown tree. Dealing crits reduce cooldown by 10%. Basically, want to be critting to get these AoEs off cooldown as fast as possible. Just spam. 10% faster cooldown to Psyker skills that are on cooldown while force weapons are being used. We're using both skills on the force weapons, so that's like spamming the 10% cooldown all the time. Defense, we've gone for trans-empiric phasing, which is just invulnerability for 3 seconds when the character's changed to exposed. Hit points, we've gone for 25 suppression resist for every warp heat point lost. The support, we've gone for every point of warp heat gains heals you for 0.5% HP. That really works well with precog because as you get hit, you gain warp heat, which heals you and also gives you damage reduction. So it, yeah, pretty self-explanatory. We've got the vulnerability, psychic mastery. Basically, just want to attach that to hemorrhage, and then just basically the full AoE tree. Just basically spamming AoEs, so makes sense. Yeah, 1% damage, even though it got, like, I wouldn't say nerfed, it got fixed. It's still extra damage. All the area effects increase are fantastic. And then just, yeah, all area effect hits reduce the skills cooldown by 4%. Just basically as much cooldown as possible, so it can just keep spamming these abilities, putting debuffs on vulnerability and stacking it up basically and doing damage. What else have we got? That's pretty much it, to be honest. Radical path, 10% warp damage because the warp blast does it, and so does hemorrhage. Take you a quick look at the psychic powers. You want to be running some weapon on the back bar. It doesn't matter what you're running, because when you use the Empyrean armor and belt slot, these skills don't go on cooldown when you weapon swap. So you have 2 skills on the back bar, basically Death Augury and what's that one? Misfortune, and just the basic skill cooldown reduction, skill duration, and skill effectiveness on both of them. And then on your main bar, I've got precog. I like to have that on my right mouse click. Just basically, the way this works is it increases your damage reduction by 100% for 60 seconds, but every time you take an instance of damage, it reduces the duration by 5 seconds and generates 2 warp heat. So you need to keep an eye on your buff bar, basically, because that is what your main survivability is from. So you need to keep rebuffing that in combat if you're taking a lot of hits and it gets basically taken off your character. We've got hemorrhage, which is just like the main spend. Well, not the main spender, but it's the main thing that goes on cooldown. The hemorrhage, it's just what stacks the vulnerability so much. We've then got precog dodge, plus 25 dodge against all range attacks. Range attacks are what the problem is. Melee, you can just run away from them, basically. And then warp speed, 25% damage and minus 20% cooldown to all attacks for 45 seconds. With using the perk, it lasts for about a minute. So yeah, and that's basically it. Like, and the rotation is just apply hemorrhage, and then witchfire, and then warp blast, kind of get these off cooldown as fast as possible, and just keep rinsing and repeating those. Buff your buffs between each room, and then just keep precog on up as high as possible, because without it you're gonna die, and that's basically the build. I'm gonna let you watch a bit of gameplay. Me and Sam were running through war zones, like without a tank, without time stop or time warp, and just basically farming warzone ranks and getting some of that favor ready for when they release the bosses, whenever that's gonna be. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. A few people asked for the build, so I'm showing it. So yeah, let me know what you think. Method out.